All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Peter Jaworski, Associate Professor and Philosopher at Georgetown University. Welcome to Free the Economy, Pete.
Thank you very much, Richard. Really good to be on with you.
Now, so I'm excited to talk today about saving lives.
Yeah.
And before we get into the details of our main topic, paying people to increase the availability of things like blood plasma and kidneys, let's talk about the philosophy behind it. So, you wrote a book with your Georgetown colleague Jason Brennan back in 2015, and there's a new edition out, but it was originally came out in 2015 called Markets Without Limits, and so that was about sort of the moral considerations of buying and selling various controversial goods and things like
hmm
biological products was one example of those kind of goods about which there's a lot of controversy about whether they should be for sale or not and under what conditions. So, can you tell us about like why you wrote that book and that kind of debate about controversial stuff being bought and sold?
Yeah, I'll speak to my own personal motivations. Jay Brennan, who's my co-author, he can tell you about his too if you speak with him. The part of the book that moved me the most was the discussion of kidneys and just the ability to use. I like nowadays I describe it as a technology. So the technology of paying donors. If we think about it as a technology, I mean, there are many different countries that restrict what kinds of technologies we can use to try to save lives. And yeah, and I think, I mean, sometimes maybe we should, but in other cases we really shouldn't. The thesis of the book is anything you may do for free, you may do for money. The idea is that money and markets don't introduce moral wrongness where none was already present. And that's as true of like paying teachers to be teachers as it is of paying donors of blood plasma or kidneys. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and the that's what, really struck me too is this distinction between something that's controversial because it's bad in and of itself versus something that's controversial because some people don't feel like really comfortable about it. So like the reason why it's bad, why, being a hitman is bad is because it's the murder part is bad. It's not someone paid you is not the bad part of the transaction, right? Um,
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
So, so there's already, a big gap between the stuff that we would say, or like in the book you say, like the reason why child pornography is bad is because, victimizing children is bad. Not, it's not the like, it wouldn't matter if it was given away or it was bartered, right? That's not the
If
point.
it
The
was
point
a
that it
gift, it
exists in
wouldn't
the
make it
first
any
place.
better.
Yeah, the point that it exists in the first place is the problem. But with things like biological, products being donated or being compensated, like you said, things like kidneys and blood plasma and potentially other products, uh, we want those to be there. We want there to be donor kidneys, right? We want that market to exist, even if some people are uncomfortable describing it as a market.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what we want is just more kidneys. We want more plasma to manufacture plasma-derived medicinal therapies. We want the stuff that we need in order to save and improve more lives, right? And then why limit ourselves to certain kinds of technologies and not others? Now, people offer reasons for why we should limit the use of certain kinds of technologies, but many of those reasons are bad when it comes to donor payment.
And so when it comes to the real world applications, we've got two categories here. You've got these like biological products where like blood plasma, where there actually is a market for, where certainly in the United States and some other countries, people do get paid for donations, and that is an ongoing process that's been around for a long time. But then you have something like donor organs, like a kidney, where there really isn't, for the most part, a kind of like established process to like incentivize people. So can you kind of like contrast those two markets like as they exist today, so we can like
Mhm.
think about where they might go tomorrow?
When it comes to kidneys, there's one country in the world that allows some form of donor compensation, which is Iran. Iran does allow a kind of payment system for kidney donations. Iran is the only country in the world that I'm aware of, anyways, that doesn't have a waiting list for kidneys. They have a wait list of people who want to sell a kidney, but they don't have a wait list of people who are waiting for a kidney. Focusing on kidneys just for a second, in the United States alone, there's approximately 100,000 people who are on a wait list for kidneys. And at the moment, they do all kinds of things. I mean, you might have seen billboards when you're driving along the highway. Sometimes people put up billboards that say, my mother needs a kidney, my husband, my wife needs a kidney. Here's a phone number. Please call. Please find out if you're a match. Sometimes people, the one that really strikes me emotionally the most are the people who walk around with, I think they're called sandwich boards, those
Mhm.
like posters that you wear. So there are people who walk around cities of like New Orleans, Miami, all over the place, and they have a billboard, a human billboard, and it says, my wife needs a kidney or my husband needs a kidney. Please see if you're a match. So over 100,000 people are waiting for a kidney, and we have good reason to believe, because of the case of Iran, that it would be some form of remuneration or compensation, some kind of incentive, financial incentive, that we could clear that wait list and thereby save a lot of lives. A nephrectomy, a kidney donation, is a big deal. It is a significant medical intervention. Um, but for many people, especially people who are young and healthy, it's not that big a deal. The risks in a kidney donation are not that much greater than driving a car for something like 500 miles or whatever the numbers are. Um, and so it would be good if we encourage more people to donate kidneys. So that's on the kidney front. There are no realistic proposals to try to change the system in the United States, at least when it comes to offering financial incentives. The most realistic proposal that is now on the table, and I want to encourage your listeners and I guess your viewers as well to check it out or maybe support it, is an effort entitled modifynota.org. Modify, Nota org. It's a group of economists, ethicists, kidney donors, kidney recipients, and so on, who are doing their best to try to create a $50,000 tax credit. It's a refundable tax credit that you would receive $10,000 a year over 5 years, right? It's refundable, meaning that if your tax liability falls below $10,000, you would receive the difference in
Right.
cash. So that's a realistic proposal being put forward by people. That's something that I think would go a very long way in helping to clear our wait list. And by the way, once we clear the 100,000 people who are currently on the wait list, for each additional year, we would need 3 to 5,000 kidneys, right? So once 100,000 people receive a kidney, then each ongoing year you need 3 to 5,000 kidneys. In a population as large as the United States, we surely should be able to find enough people, provided that we incentivize them in this way. So that's kidneys. Um, yeah, Richard, do you want to say something about that before we move on to plasma?
Well, yeah, that the I think for some people the government tax credit makes it as the means of the incentive makes it seem safer somehow rather than private people, millionaires bidding up the cost of kidneys and potentially um and and I think if that's the most likely way forward, as you were saying, that it makes sense um to push for that as a reasonable, medium space between a sort of complete cash market um, for organ donation. And I think there's a kind of an analogy to drug legalization here, where a lot of civil libertarian type people have said, well, drug, recreational drugs like marijuana, they really should be legalized. People shouldn't be in jail just for buying, selling, or using a drug like that. And so you have one route would be just complete legalization or complete decriminalization and no further action whatsoever, and which is probably what I would prefer. But in order to get across the finish line of actual legalization in most states in the United States, you've had to sort of reassure people that there will be this sort of like regulatory and tax structure, right, that will be applied specifically, not just sort of like the sales tax, like with everything else, but it would be applied specifically to something like legalized marijuana, and so that I think you know introduces some like additional complications that probably aren't really necessary to a market for something like that. But if a little bit of extra bureaucracy on the other end gets you past the point of sending people to jail for it, like if that's what persuades people to vote for legalization, I think that's probably great.
Mhm.
And maybe a compensated donation model in a pure sort of like, libertarian utopia might look slightly different than a government tax credit. But if a government tax credit actually helps us like clear some of that backlog of people who are like sick and waiting for kidneys, then that's probably the best, compromise move forward as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, there is the value of liberty, but let's not overlook or underplay the value of life also. And if a proposal like this would improve the odds that people can live a long and healthy life, then that counts in favor of it. And by the way, um, no one has proposed an auction model for
Mm.
organs. That was actually the original motivation behind the National Organ Transplantation Act, which is the law that forbids the use of financial incentives for organ donation. The original reason for that law, it was passed in 1984. Prior to 1984, it was legal to pay people in the United States for organ donation. But there was a gentleman who took out ads all across the United States seeking to auction off his kidneys to the single kidney, I should say, not kidneys plural, but seeking to auction off his kidney to the highest bidder. And that upset enough people that a movement was started to change the law to ban the use of financial incentives. Yeah.
Mm. And so so we have that situation where there really is no kind of like compensation market yet for donation of something like a kidney, but then you have this the situation with blood plasma where um, at least in the United States, you've had donors who have been compensated for a long time, and it's just a very standard practice. And I don't, I, as far as I know, it's that in and of itself is not particularly controversial, but it's different in different countries. And I think you've pointed out in the past that there are places where they don't pay for blood plasma, and they get sort of high and mighty about the fact that they don't pay for it, and think that's sort of a morally preferable system. Yet their medical system imports plasma from places where it is compensated.
That's exactly what. In fact, around the world, either you have a system that financially compensates or remunerates plasma donors, or you have a shortfall and depend on imports from the countries that allow financial incentives and compensation. I should specify, by the way, this is blood plasma that is used to manufacture plasma-derived medicinal therapies like immunoglobulin. This is not plasma used for transfusion. And what countries import is the final product. They import immunoglobulin, but that immunoglobulin is that immunoglobulin is manufactured using the plasma of either compensated or remunerated donors. The United States, just by way of background, the United States is currently approximately 65 to 68% of the entire global supply of plasma to manufacture these therapies. That's an enormous figure. The rest of the world contributes, like every other country together, contributes so little by comparison. If you add Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in the European Union, those are the four countries that allow compensation for plasma donations. If you include those countries, the number gets awfully close to like 84 to 90% of the entire global supply to manufacture these therapies comes from those five countries. Those five countries are the ones that make it possible for patients with rare diseases like primary or secondary immune deficiencies, people whose blood has difficulty clotting, a number of neurological ailments are treated using immunoglobulin and other plasma-derived medicinal therapies. That's basically the entire globe hinges on what happens in the United States. And the reason why the United States provides so much plasma, I mean, one possibility is that, Americans are just more altruistic than Canadians or Australians or Europeans, right? I mean, leave that open. That's a possibility. Americans do donate blood without being paid for it at rates comparable to and sometimes higher than countries like Canada and the European Union. So of course, leaving open the possibility that altruism is a driver here. The other difference is that they allow payment, right? In the United States, people can be paid to donate plasma. I've done it. I hope you've done it. I hope lots of your listeners have done it. You can get paid for it here, and you get paid pretty good. It's like $65 to sit in a chair for an hour and a half. That's like the average compensation. An hour and a half, the procedure is no big deal, right? Like donating plasma is not like donating a kidney. You can get faint, you can feel tired or something like that, but For an hour and a half, $65, that's a good deal.
Oh yeah, and so one of the we sort of talked about the possibility of with if there were a wider or more open market for full organ donations, whether there would be a an auction and bidding up of available organs. Um, with that example from the United States back in the 80s. But I think a lot of people today would say, oh, well, if, you know, compensated organ donation, kidney donation were legal worldwide, it would be people in poor countries would be donating or
Mm,
and getting paid for organs, and then
right.
that would be an example of exploitation because only poor people would give up their organs, and of course, wealthier people in the United States, and of course, on a global status, on a global scale, most people in the United States are wealthy compared to the poorest countries in the world. So it would be, we'd be organ farming in Bangladesh or wherever pick your low income country of choice. Um, but what's interesting is that you know to me anyway, it seems like critics are saying uh, poor people would be incentivized to donate a kidney if it were $10,000 or $20,000. They would get paid for it. Therefore, we need to pass a law to stop them from being exploited to get this money. But no one is proposing to pay every poor person who would have donated a kidney $10,000 or $20,000 otherwise, right?
Hmm.
They're just saying we're going to make it illegal for you to make money in a certain way voluntarily, but we're not going to like provide you with any benefit. There's not like any global don't sell your kidney reimbursement fund that anyone's proposing. And to me it seems like there's a certain analogy between public policy in the United States on other topics where they're sort of like middle class and upper middle class people are generally the people most making policy in this country. And they say, well, certain things just aren't good enough, so we're going to ban them, or they're insufficient, or they're below the level of dignity for our citizens. But they don't make any effort to provide the better thing. They just outlaw the cheap, accessible thing, like with housing, right? Most cities, don't let you operate an SRO, single residence occupancy, these like little mini apartments without private bathrooms, the sort of places where like down and out people who don't have much money used to live 100 years ago, 70 years ago in a lot of big cities. Then people came along and said, "Oh, we don't like those. Those are substandard apartments. Those can't exist anymore. They're literally illegal." But they didn't create any provision for the people who were living in those cheapest possible apartments to get anything better. So some of those people are literally just homeless now.
Yeah.
And so making the cheap thing illegal made life worse for the people that they were supposedly trying to help. So it makes me wonder if we have a similar sort of, kind of upper middle class arrogance saying we're going to protect you by making sure you can't make any money.
Will protect you by limiting your options. Yeah, look, the way to make these comparisons and the way to make an effective exploitation argument is to look at the status quo and to look at the realistic alternatives. And then to look at it from the perspective of the people who would choose this option as compared with whatever constrained options they currently have, and then to make a judgment as to whether or not that improves or worsens their lot. Yeah. The status quo isn't what a lot of people think it is, right? Like this sourcing kidneys from poor countries, that is the status quo. Paying people for kidney donations is illegal, but that, if you're on the cusp of death, you're going to do a lot to try to survive. And what a lot of people do is go to villages in the Philippines, for example, and illegally, it's illegal, right? But let's not kid ourselves just because Congress or some legislature somewhere in the world passes a law, it's not like magic fairy dust that gets sprinkled over the world and then suddenly this activity stops altogether. No, people continue to do it, especially if their lives are on the line. So the status quo includes one, it includes this form of exploitation, right? It does already. Two, the people who step up to donate kidneys right now are not the best from a medical perspective. So if I needed a kidney, you can believe that my mother would step forward and volunteer to donate her kidney to me. From a medical perspective, my mother is not an ideal candidate for a nephrectomy, right? But she would if my life was at stake. And in the United States, under the status quo, lots of people feel pressure. This is like familial pressure, or like coercion that you might experience from certain kinds of family bonds and family expectations. People feel that pressure to donate kidneys, even if they don't want to, and even when they are not the medically best suited candidate. Um, I have a friend of mine who donated his kidney. Oh, maybe I shouldn't say his name now that I said that. Okay, so I have a friend of mine who's a philosopher. He donated his kidney altruistically to a stranger in the United States. Um, yeah, no, I don't want to. I don't want to out him because he doesn't like to talk about the fact that he donated a kidney. But he has a proposal where the amount of money would be $100,000. So not like $10,000 or $20,000, which might be the market clearing price, but an amount that's significantly higher than the market clearing price. And the reason for that higher price is to attract people who are in their 20s, who may be poor but may not be poor, right? They might be middle class, they might even be wealthy, right? And the point is to attract these like healthier candidates, so like people for whom a nephrectomy really is medically not that big of a deal. And then that way you can both supply the needed kidneys, but not at the expense of any donor's health, right? So this would be a proposal, and no one's suggesting that it would be international. In Iran, you have to be a citizen of Iran to participate in the kidney system that they have. You need to be a citizen of Iran to be able to pay for a kidney, and you need to be a citizen of Iran in order to be able to sell your kidney. They don't allow Americans to go to Iran and participate in their kidney system. Similarly, in the United States, there would be no proposal suggesting like an international flow of kidneys. That's just not a realistic proposal. Instead, it would be constrained to the United States. We would offer a sum of money that presumably would attract way more people than we need, right? And then that way, the medical professionals can select from a larger pool of willing donors, and they can select on the basis of, one, the match to the patient who needs it, but also, secondly and importantly, on the basis of how much of a big deal this is for the donor, right? So that would be a way to move forward. And the same thing is true on the side of blood plasma. I find these objections just mind-boggling. I don't even get them. If plasma donation was a dangerous practice, we could have a conversation. If plasma donation was tantamount to like a kidney donation or something similar to it, we could have a very reasonable conversation about exploitation. But as far as I'm concerned, donating plasma is no big deal. The risks associated with donating plasma are so tiny. The amount of money that you receive in return for that hour and a half that you spend at the plasma center is very large. The proportion of the revenue per liter of plasma that a donor receives, because some people, I read every news story about plasma because this is actually my primary area of research. I read every single newspaper story written about plasma. And I always read the comments in those sections, and people are under the impression that these companies are selling a liter of plasma for like $2,000. Total nonsense. The international price of a liter of plasma is around $200. There's still a couple of contracts kicking around at the like $210, $230 level, but there are also contracts at around $195 for an average of something like $200, maybe $205 in revenue per liter of plasma. From that liter, the donor gets over 30%, right? When you donate something like 700 milliliters on average. That's $65. So per liter, it's about $80, $85 that the donor receives. $80 to $85 out of $200 in revenue. That's the split. The company gets 10 to 20% in profit. So on all of these things, it looks to me more like a windfall than exploitation. Right. And if I had limited options, the other benefit of this is you're saving lives. And I think people who sell their plasma ought to feel good about what they're doing. I know that popularly there's this stigma. I do my best to like combat the stigma as far as I can. I don't have that kind of influence, but I do it. I try anyways. Right. But like people are like, I'm so poor, I'm so broke. I donated plasma. I hate it when people say something like that. Right. I think people who sell their plasma should be proud of what they're doing. They've saved lives. Yeah, maybe their primary motivation was the money, but I don't care. The result is the same. You save lives. You should feel good about that, right? You really should. So as far as the exploitation argument, I just scratch my head. I'm confused. I think bioethicists who are on the other side of this issue, like they just don't understand what exploitation is, or they just don't understand plasma donation. Those are the best explanations that I have for that. You
Mhm.
can make a case that the kidneys are different. You could try to make a robust exploitation argument with respect to kidneys, but that's because the risk profile is very different. The risks are very different. But with something like this, like if we figured out like a medical use for our fingernails, that would be a bonanza, right? Like, right? If companies were willing to pay you to like give you a manicure so that they can use the proteins in your fingernails or whatever's in your fingernails that might be medically useful or whatever, that would be fantastic. So what if the people who went and got the like paid for manicures are poor? Even better, right? Because they need that money more than like you or I do.
Right.
That's great all around. That would just be fantastic, a windfall, a bonanza. And if somebody suggested that it's exploitative, I mean, that stuff I would not approve a paper as a referee if somebody was like, this is unless it's a really clever argument that I haven't come across yet.
Well, yeah, and so the money part of this, I think, is interesting for multiple angles. And there's one argument that I've always heard about, compensating donors. Um, well, kind of two, but the first one is, uh, when there is, a significant medical procedure, like say, like like an organ transplant, everyone else involved gets paid. Like the hospital
Oh
gets
yeah.
paid, the doctor gets paid, the person in the helicopter with the cooler full with the organ in it gets paid. Um, everyone except the donor who is making this procedure possible. And so for the argument, that it's like it's not appropriate to pay organ donors, even if you're not worried about it being someone from, say, like a very poor country abroad, even in the United States, it's not okay to pay, ordinary, middle class Americans. Yet it's perfectly, and we absolutely expect every single other person who's involved in that process to get paid because they're providing something of value. The transplant surgeon certainly is, the anesthesiologist is, the nurse is. Uh, what, do the people who object to, like, organ donation in the United States, do they reckon with that argument? Does it make any difference to them to say like everyone else gets
No,
paid, why not the person?
I mean, I should say I haven't yet seen a serious reckoning with that fact. And it's true. It's exactly as you've described it, right? And also, once the substance or organ is out of the donor's body, it gets sold on. This is as true in the European Union as it is in Canada and elsewhere, right? Like, there's money being made. People are paid to collect it. People are paid to distribute it. People pay all over the place, with the exception of the donor. Do they reckon with that argument? Do they discuss? And not really. I mean, the best that I've gotten out of people is this sort of like, oh, that's different because it's a profession. Right. So like the nurse or the phlebotomist gets paid during a blood plasma donation. And when I pointed out, I'm like, look, well, isn't it weird that like everybody gets paid except for the donor? Isn't that unusual? And if we're worried about the commodification of the substance itself, like the plasma, isn't paying people to pull it out, paying people to transport it, paying for it directly if you need it. In at least some countries, you have to pay for a transfusion or for the therapy, right? Paying for it directly, doesn't that commodify the substance? Why does it commodify it only if you pay the donor? That seems strange. And then their response is, well, it's a profession. So they get paid for it because it's a profession, and that makes it different. And I'd really like to know why. And if any of your listeners actually has a good explanation for why this difference between it being a profession and not being a profession makes a difference, I'd love to hear it. Because, I mean, a lot of plasma donors, you can donate twice a week, up to 104 times a year in the United States. You can make a mini profession out of it. So then and then is the problem that they don't have to go to school for it or something like that? Fine, we can set up these schools, call it plasma donation school. And then they have to get certified. And then they get this like little license or something. And then, okay, now it's a profession. Now what? Right? Suddenly it's what that they have to go to school or something that makes the difference. That makes no sense to me. The only thing that I can think of is being a profession. The nurse doesn't get paid for the like care that he provides, right? It's not for the caring that you get paid. Instead, you get paid for the time and the effort involved in providing the care, and in the time and the effort it took for you to become licensed or registered or educated in your profession. So you're compensated for stuff you've done in the past, and you're remunerated for your time and effort and maybe opportunity cost, but you don't get paid for the care. If so, then why can't I make a similar argument with respect to plasma? People are not paid for the plasma, they are paid for their time and effort associated with the donation of plasma. So the plasma itself is not being directly paid for. When I make a case like that, people say, well, that's a euphemism. We all know that what's being paid for is the plasma itself. Although I will note that, like, I'd love to know what your theory is on what the object of exchange is, because we have asymmetries all over the place. Like, I sell my plasma, right? Or I choose to sell my plasma not because I care about the plasma, right? I care about my time and effort. So from the seller's perspective, I'm like, well, how much time is this going to take? How inconvenient is this? Is this painful? And so on. I want compensation for that stuff. I don't care about the plasma. If I cared about the plasma, if I was fetishizing it or something like that, then I wouldn't sell it, right?
Mhm.
So then from the donor's perspective, it's not the plasma that's being sold, it's time and effort that's being compensated for. From the buyer's perspective, they don't care about your time or your effort. They care about the plasma, sure. So from their perspective, they're buying plasma, but from seller's perspective, I'm selling time and effort. Why should buyer's perspective be prioritized when we're trying to figure out exactly what the object of exchange is? And just incidentally, um, United States tax and liability courts agree with me. So we do have that. There have been many tax cases around people who have failed to like pay their taxes when they donate plasma. You do have to pay taxes if you make more than $600 a year donating plasma. People have tried all kinds of arguments. One is like, oh, I've sold property, and so what I owe is the gain on the capital. So I owe a capital gains tax.
Mhm.
There's a famous case, Green is the last name, but she received $75,000 a year back in the 1970s selling her plasma, which is a huge amount of money if you think about it. She had a very rare type of plasma. She didn't pay her taxes. They took her to court. First court said, you go to jail for 12 months for tax evasion. She appealed. Before the Court of Appeals, she made this property argument. She said that the basis in her plasma was $75,000 and she was paid $75,000. So there was no tax liability. She owed
Mhm.
nothing. The court said that's no good because you didn't sell your plasma and it isn't property, right? What you sold is your time and effort. That's what the
Mhm.
tax courts repeatedly say. Also, under liability law, the transfusion that you get at a hospital is not considered the sale of a product. If it were, it would fall under products liability law, and then there would be strict liability on the hospitals. But in 1956, in a court case involving Martha Perlmutter, who got a tainted blood transfusion, the court ruled that the hospital did not sell a product. They didn't sell blood, even though the bill said $60 or $50 for blood. That's explicitly what it said on the bill. The court said, no, no, no. What you paid for is a service, and the blood was incidental to the service of like being treated or whatever. So those are two examples where if your response to me, when I say you're not being paid for the plasma itself, but for your time and effort, if you respond to that by saying that's obviously euphemistic and we all know what's really going on, I'm like, well, the courts in the United States agree with me, not with you. So you need a better like theory or a better story about why we know that the plasma is the thing that is being sold rather than the time and the effort.
Oh yeah, that is an impressively niche subgenre of legal theory. The the plasma and organ donation law and precedent. Um, and so in speaking of money, that you know, one other thing I think is interesting is that you have so like in the case again with kidney donations, people looking for transplants, you have people on this list. Not everyone's going to make it, obviously, because not everyone's going to make it. Some people are going to pass away before they get to the top of that list. Um, but even if we assumed that most of these people would continue living and would not die, there's still the sort of degraded quality of life that comes with that, and the expense, if we're just thinking about money here, right, of treating people with dialysis, for example, which can be
Mhm.
very expensive. And so so if you said, oh, maybe there should be a $100,000, compensation for organ donation or something. People would say, oh gosh, that sounds like a lot of money. And maybe if that's a tax credit, if the taxpayers are paying for it, oh, that seems like $100,000 is a lot of money to most people. But the costs incurred by treating someone with kidney disease is also very large. That may not be the most important moral factor here, but that is also something to consider, that the people on that transplant list aren't just, goofing around and going on cruises and living the time of their life. It's difficult and can be painful living with
Yeah.
that kidney disease, even if it wasn't going to be fatal in the near term.
Yeah, many of these people have to quit their jobs, right? Because they have to once or twice a week go to a dialysis center and then it's hours. They sit in a chair for hours and a machine, does the job of what their kidneys used to do. Kidney dialysis is the biggest expense for both Medicare and Medicaid,
Oh,
right?
wow.
It's covered by both. It's the largest expense. It's super expensive. Something like I'm working from memory here, so the numbers are rough. Don't quote me on this, but it's like $60,000 to $80,000 per year, and the average end-stage renal disease patient is on dialysis for something like 5 to 8 years. When you crunch the numbers, the tax expenditure on dialysis right now far exceeds any of the proposals that have been put forward to have the government just pay for it, right? So this modified NOTA proposal that I mentioned. It's a $50,000 tax credit. That would save tax money, not cost the government more, right? We have a lot of, because you would eliminate some of that cost of dialysis, you have a lot of room in the budget, in the government budget to do this. So even if we were to just cover everybody, even wealthy people, right? If we were to just have a policy where we pay $50,000 in tax credits to just anybody who donates a kidney, that would be a net savings to the United States government, even if they chose to cover everybody, whereas Medicare and Medicaid doesn't cover everybody, right? Similarly, on the plasma collection side, since we're talking about costs, some people might be surprised, although you shouldn't be, but like some people might be surprised to discover that the cost of collecting plasma when we pay donors is 2 to 4 times less than the cost per liter of systems like Canadian Blood Services, New Zealand Blood Services, Australia's Red Cross Lifeblood, and so on, where they don't pay donors, right? And if that's puzzling for people, think about the volume or the total number of liters that a plasma collection center collects each year. When it's compensated or remunerated, the average plasma collection center in the United States at maturity collects about 50,000 liters per year. Canadian Blood Services collects something like 10 to 15,000 liters per year. But the overhead costs are similar, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you divide the total number of liters collected by your overhead costs, it costs Canadian Blood Services something like $400 to $500 per liter to collect a liter of plasma, whereas in the United States, as I've already told you, the price of a liter of plasma is $200, right? So if you pay donors, it's also cheaper. And so you might wonder, like in a place like, because it's perfectly safe. In over 30 years, we haven't seen the transmission of any transfusion transmissible infection from the use of plasma-derived medicinal therapies like immunoglobulin made from the plasma of paid donors. It's perfectly safe. It's way more efficient. It's much more like it's cheaper. And then that money comes out of the healthcare budget of the provinces in Canada. So if they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on their immunoglobulin portfolio, on their plasma collection system, I mean, that's money that could be going to other healthcare needs. And instead of just going ahead and allowing commercial companies to, allowing private capital to flow into saving lives, this is another aspect of this debate that I find puzzling. Isn't it great that like we have commercial companies that collect plasma? That's private capital that could have flown into yachts or Apple or whatever, but instead is flowing into something that has this life-saving effect, right? That's fantastic. That augments the amount of money spent on healthcare with the purpose of saving lives. That's a really good thing. You allow commercial companies to enter Canada and collect plasma. You get a massive influx of additional money being spent on the health of Canadian patients. Fantastic all around.
All right. Well, Pete, you've convinced me.
No, well, geez,
And
did I need to?
and
Richard?
hopefully and hopefully some people listening too. Well, thank you so much. This has been an excellent interview. And first of all, everyone should go out and donate plasma. Second, they should
Yeah.
buy the second edition of Markets Without Limits on Amazon.com. And where else can people find you and all of your impressive expertise?
If you Google my name, Peter Jaworski, you can find my faculty website at Georgetown University, and then I do post all of my articles and other things up there. I should note for your listeners, if they do go donate plasma and they're in a country like the United States where it's legal to do so, every once in a while I will send people via PayPal or Venmo or whatever, like an extra sum of money if they post a picture of themselves donating plasma and they tag me on Twitter. So I've done that the last 2 years. That's I cap it at $500 a year, but I will give you additional money if you want additional money if you donate plasma. Post a pic on Twitter and tag me on Twitter.
All right, fantastic. Post those pics, folks. All right. Thanks again, Pete.
Yeah, my pleasure, Richard. Thank you for having me.